Chapter 33 Sorrows and Secrets. Double Loss. On September 7th, 1954, after a decade of suffering from Parkinson's disease, Evangeline Lindbergh died at the age of 78. After hearing the news, Charles flew immediately to Detroit. Anne and the children, however, did not arrive for another 4 days. In that time, Charles and brother struggled with details of Evangeline's funeral, choosing a casket and deciding on a gravesite. Charles must have also struggled with his emotions, although he left no record of them. Throughout his mother's illness, he'd visited often. Toward the end of her life, bedridden, her voice weak and slurred, she still brightened at the sight of her son. A look would pass between them as Charles sat beside her in the old, dark and gloomy house, a look so loving that even 8-year-old Reeve could feel the nature of it. Evangeline would smile. The only time I can remember seeing any expression on her face at all, said Reeve. Then she tried to speak. Only Charles understood her, or pretended to. The arrival of his family was a relief. Anne chose her mother-in-law's dress and picked out the psalms to be read at her simple funeral service. They buried Evangeline quietly, without press, in an old country graveyard among her land and lodge kin. 2 months later, Anne and the children, Charles was traveling, went to Next Day Hill for Thanksgiving. Betty Morrow, lively as always. At 81. Wore red to dinner. And held a contest to see which of her grandchildren could guess the weight of the turkey. After the meal, Reeve, who'd recently celebrated her 9th birthday, put on her tutu and danced for everyone, while 14-year-old Nancy reluctantly played her flute. The next morning, Friday, 12-year-old Scott took a walk with his grandma Bee into the garden to cut the last of the roses. talked about Christmas presents. On Saturday, Betty put her hand to her head and sat. On Saturday, Betty put her hand to her head and said she felt odd. By the time the doctor arrived, she'd lost her speech and was partially paralyzed, a stroke her physician diagnosed. He hoped she'd improve with time, but 10 days later she suffered a second stroke and sank into a coma. For the next 7 weeks, Anne stayed with her mother, holding her hand and reading her poetry until Betty's death on January 24th, 1955. Exhausted and grieving, Anne sat down to write Charles with the news. She had no idea where he was or how to contact him. Instead, she sent the letter to his attention in care of the Pan Am office. She hoped it would reach him sooner rather than later. Somehow it did. Charles arrived home from Europe just in time for Betty's funeral. Secret families, secret lives. In March 1958, on one of his numerous trips to Europe, Charles met the dark-haired Hesheimer sisters. Bridget and Marietta. It was at a small gathering in a Munich apartment where he'd gone with his private secretary and translator Valiska. Everyone at the get-together, of course, knew Valiska was also his girlfriend. The two had been having an affair for the past 3 years, but that didn't stop the sisters from admiring him. Bridget noticed his way of speaking, his beautiful hands, his smile, and the dimple on his chin. Charles noticed her too, and even though he'd come with his girlfriend, he asked Bridget to show him around the city. She agreed, and 2 days later they spent the afternoon together. By dinner time, he made a sudden confession. He loved her. The couple hurried back to her apartment. It was the start of a 17-year-old. It was the start of a 17-year relationship that ended only with Charles' death. Together, he and Bridget had 3 children: Dirk, born in 1958, Astrid, born in 1960, and David, born in 1967. But that did not mean Charles gave up his relationship with Valeska. Instead, he started a 3rd family with her, fathering a son in 1959 and a daughter in 1961. Their identities, including Valeska's last name, remain secret. Incredibly, he also began a love affair with Bridget's sister Marietta. In 1962, Vago was born to them, followed by Christoph in 1967. The secret families, 2 living in Germany and 1 Marietta's in Switzerland, knew about each other. They also knew about Charles' wife and 5 children in the United States, but Anne knew nothing, and Charles worked hard to keep it that way, reminding the women of the need for utmost secrecy. He supported them financially by sending large sums of cash rather than checks that could be easily traced, and he had them write to him at a post office box in Connecticut that he changed frequently. He visited his families 4 times a year for a few days each time. Like his American children, they never knew when he might turn up. Sometimes he arrived only to have to leave immediately because of what he claimed was unexpected business. What did the children think their father did? Charles concocted a story with which their mothers went along. His name, he told them, was Carew Kent, and he was a much-traveled American author, geologist, and ecologist. But that was nobody's business, he stressed. They were not to talk about him to anybody. If they did, he would never come back. The children didn't whisper a word. When father visited, they went on outings and played video games. He told them animal stories and whisked up omelets for breakfast. The houses were lively. Even when he was away, they knew he cared about them. Hadn't he built houses for both Bridget's and Marietta's family? Didn't he typically end all his letters with "My love to you and the children, all I can send"? Of course, he signed only his first initial C, and he wrote carefully, committing nothing to paper that would give away his identity should the letter fall into the wrong hands. And it worked, all of it. No one ever knew. Charles had 3 secret families. Even after his death, the women kept mum. It was Astrid, grown and searching for books written by her father, Carew Kent, who stumbled onto the truth. She showed a family photograph of him to a friend who recognized him. Was Charles Lindbergh her father? Astrid asked Bridget, her mother. Bridget admitted he was, but refused to let Astrid share the truth or her letters from him, 150 in all, until after her death. Not until 2005 did Astrid and her brothers let others in on the secret. When DNA conclusively proved their parentage, the news stunned those who'd known Charles. 3 secret families, 7 more children. It seemed inconsistent with the chilly, exacting man who found physical displays of emotion embarrassing. Theories abounded as to why he did it. A eugenicist to the end. Perhaps he wanted to spread what he believed was superior genetic material, or maybe it had something to do with his lifelong obsession with immortality. The only person who knew the truth, of course, was Charles, and he left no inkling, said his daughter Reeve. I don't know why he lived this way, and I don't think I will ever know. But what it means to me is that every intimate human connection my father had during his later years was fractured by secrecy.
Jeff, you're going to pool now. Do you want to come? Yes or no? Yes or no? No? Okay.
An African state of mind. In 1962, Charles traveled to Kenya. The vibrancy of nature in the wild, the stark rhythms of life and death. hunger and thirst thrilled him. He wrote, "Toby Buck, battling Toby Buck, a lioness sinking her teeth into the black and white striped throat of a zebra, hyenas fighting over a warthog carcass. Even more thrilling were the weeks he spent in a Maasai village. The freedom of these people, who lived off the land without schedules or technology, forced him to recognize the complications of his own life. He'd always thought of himself as a free man, but was he really? With the sun on his face and dust on his boots, in the prick of thorns, and amid the yelling of hyenas and the bark of zebras, the 60-year-old had yet another epiphany. At long last, he claimed he understood the purpose of life. The man who'd spent so much of his time asking why people had to die now wrote, "When I watch wild animals on an African plain, my civilized methods of measuring time give way to a timeless vision in which life embraces the necessity of death in a miraculous plan of existence." Death, he realized, was life. Another stage of existence, the eternal life for which men during centuries have sought so blindly, not realizing that they had it as a birthright. He now saw his experiments with Dr. Carroll as tampering in trying to overcome death and maintain life artificially. They'd been dangerously meddling with something beyond their comprehension. Their scientific success would have separated man from his God-given right to immortality. Only by dying, he concluded, can we continue living. Charles had come full circle. As a child, he'd drawn comfort and inspiration from the natural world. Now recognizing that his latest insight had sprung from the wilderness, he resolved to help protect the world's natural places. "I did so casually," he later told a reporter, after reading in the New York Times about the recent information of the American chapter of the Switzerland-based World Wildlife Federation. He telephoned the organization's chairman, Ira Gabrielson, and offered to build up conservation interest all over the world, using his fame to get into the offices and boardrooms of political and business leaders. He spoke with them directly about saving endangered wildlife and habitats. Charles, who could be charming when he wanted to be, he scored some big successes. He persuaded Indonesian officials to provide some protections for the Javanese rhino. And he lobbied President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines to create preserves for both the endangered monkey-eating eagle and the tamaraw, a wild buffalo native to the island. He even sat down with whales being caught off the coast of that country. So convincing was Charles, the board of directors decided to end the harpooning of endangered whales in that region. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Charles had cut down on his army and Pan Am commitments, but his appearances on behalf of the World Wildlife Federation and other conservation groups multiplied. The man who'd given up speaking after the war now returned to the podium on behalf of the bald eagle, the golden lion, tamarin, the black rhino. He didn't claim to be an expert on conservation. I just tell people how important it is, he said willingly. He gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. He lent his name to fundraising efforts, and he surprised people when the most famous aviator of the 20th century, said, "I realized that if I had to choose, I would rather have birds than airplanes." One last checklist. On a sparkling July afternoon in 1974, Charles lay naked in the sun on the rocks at Scott's Cove. The 72-year-old felt content as he gazed up at the sky. He'd just returned to Connecticut after a string of tests and biopsies. His cancer was spreading. Cancer. No one but Anne knew he had it. He'd sworn her to secrecy after he'd been diagnosed with lymphoma the previous October. But radiation therapy had caused him to drop 30 pounds from his lean frame. And for the first time he looked his age. Worried, his children had asked after his health. It was a virus he'd picked up on his travels, he'd told them. Nothing serious, still they could see it was serious enough for him to return to living with Anne. It was the first time the couple had lived together for an extended period in decades. She'd been at his side when he grew anemic and suffered through a case of the shingles and then a bout of the flu. Just this past month, he'd spiked such a high fever, he'd been hospitalized. Doctors began blood transfusions and a course of chemotherapy, and his children learned the truth. He played down the seriousness of his disease, of course. There was no need to tell all his private medical details, but he had no illusions. Charles was dying and he knew it. Now he let the sun warm his skin and listened to surf and seagulls. He wasn't concerned about death anymore. He saw that it was no longer an ending, but an opening. Charles had intended to go to Switzerland in August. This would have taken him close to his other families, and he might have hoped to say goodbye in person. But after a new round of tests, doctors told him the cancer had spread. It would be impossible to travel. He understood. And he had one last checklist. First, he telephoned his publisher, William Jovanovich. Could Bill come to the hospital to discuss a project? When Jovanovich arrived that same day, Charles pointed to a brown leather bag on the floor. It was his autobiography, 400 pages he'd been working on for decades. There were more pages too. He locked away at Yale University, where he'd been depositing his personal papers since 1940. Charles asked the publisher to take the bag home, read it, and decide whether it was good enough to be published. Jovanovich read what Charles had given him that night, and the next day they drew up a contract. Charles left the shaping and editing of the material to his publisher. It would be published posthumously. In 1978 under the title Autobiography of Values. Next, he wrote his families in Europe. They knew about his cancer. He had told them weeks ago. Now he bade them farewell. His letter to Bridget read, Dear Bridget, my strength is leaving every day. The situation is serious. It's very difficult just for me to write. My love to you and the children. all I can see. P.S. You will be getting word from a bank in Geneva asking you to come and see them. Go as soon as possible and personally hold the utmost secrecy. He said goodbye to his American family too. Grown now, Nancy and Scott both flew in from France. Reeve drove in from Vermont. John came from Seattle and Land from Montana. For the first time in a long while, they were all together. Finally, Charles reviewed his will. After making a few changes to the 14-page document, he turned to Anne and stunned her by saying, I want to go home to Maui. In 1970, he'd built an A-frame structure on 100 acres of grassland near the remote village of Kibalulu on the Hawaiian island of Maui. The place did not have a telephone or electricity. Propane motors powered the appliances, and kerosene provided lighting. This was where he wanted to die. Impossible, his doctors replied. He'd never get there alive. En route, he'd have a hemorrhage or experience a heart attack, but Charles told them he'd made up his mind. But you're abandoning science, exclaimed one physician. No, replied Charles, science abandoned me. On August 18th, his stretcher was carried into the first-class section, reserved entirely for him and Anne, of a plane bound for Honolulu. There they transferred to an ambulance plane that took them to Maui. He and Anne settled into a friend's guest house in Hana. Without electricity or phone, Charles A. Frame was out of the question. Under Charles' watchful eye, the doctor installed the oxygen equipment in his room. Always fond of machines, Charles tested out the pump, face mask, and pressure regulators before falling asleep to the sound of the surf. But his checklist wasn't done. As with all his important ventures, the flight across the Atlantic, choosing a wife, searching for a lost son, he left no detail to chance. His grave would be dug in traditional Hawaiian style. He'd already chosen and purchased the site, blessed by a local holy man and lined in lava rock. His coffin would be handmade from local trees and lined with cotton sheets and an old blanket he'd once given his mother, and his corpse would be dressed in a well-worn pair of gray cotton pants and a khaki shirt, no belt or shoes. Wanting a natural burial, Charles insisted his body not go to mortuary for embalming, but straight from his deathbed to his grave. There would be a brief graveside service, but no eulogy. As for hymns, the music is all right, but the words are corny, he told Anne. He settled on Hawaiian ones. Then nobody will know what they mean. Last, he chose the design of a simple headstone. Below his name should be the dates and places of his birth and death, along with this passage from Psalms. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. When he wasn't going over his checklist, Charles reminisced with Anne and his sons. Nancy and Reeve had stayed behind in Connecticut, where they waited for updates about his childhood and his early flying days. He talked about America first, too. Don't let your mother spend a lot of time defending me, he said to Land. One night, Anne asked him what it felt like to be dying. One night, Anne, the most surprising part, he answered, was the realization that death is so close all the time. It's right there next to you. But it didn't frighten him. It's harder on you watching than it is on me. On the night of August 25th, his breathing became labored. His physician brought him a larger oxygen mask. Now, doctor, asked Charles, is the caliber of the oxygen tube really large enough to supply me with the oxygen I need? Hours later, he reached toward the respirator to adjust the valve. Then his hand dropped, and he lapsed into a coma. Anne and the land stayed with him through the night. His wife held his hand. His son, knowing how much Charles disliked being touched, laid his hand on the blanket covering his father's foot. The sun peaked above the horizon on the morning of the 26th. The sky turned pink. Charles breathed in. I am form, and I am formless, reads the last paragraph of his autobiography of values. I am life, and I am matter, mortal and immortal, and the molecules of my being will return to the earth and the sky. They came from the stars. I am of the stars. Charles Lindbergh released his last breath.